What's going on, guys? My name is Arrow, and in today's video, we are talking about the best defensive mechanic in the game that nobody's talking about.
What killed the dinosaurs? The Ice Age!
Armor is a mechanic that lowers your physical damage taken, but as the hit gets bigger, the mitigation is less effective. Also, it doesn't work against physical damage over time. Evasion is a mechanic that allows you to not be hit by attacks, but it's a system that works in such a way that you will get hit from time to time, and then you don't have any mitigation for those hits. Damage taken as can be a really useful way to take physical as fire and then mitigate that with fire resistance and less fire damage taken. But then you can have your damage reduction of the fire type reduced, such as lowering max res, and then you are weak against both the fizz and the fire. Maximum res is good until monsters penetrate your res or lower your res, and you are incredibly vulnerable to those types of damage. Generic physical damage reduction, also known as flat PDR, is very strong, but this can be reduced as well, and many monsters have physical as extra modifiers. So while your PDR will reduce the physical damage taken, they might be doing 1, 2, or 300% of physical as another element. Spell suppression is arguably the best defensive mechanic in the entire game, but you're still taking hits, and sometimes these hits can be really big, especially when they're critical strikes, or maybe they're lowering the amount of spell suppression that you're doing. There is one defensive mechanic in the entire game that prevents all types of damage, and that defensive mechanic is freeze.
I'm afraid that my condition has left me cold to your pleas of mercy.
That's right. Freeze is the best defensive mechanic in the game. Now, if you are a hardcore player, you're going to want to probably move on from this video. Freeze is not a reliable defensive mechanic for hardcore. There are certain things you cannot freeze, such as pinnacle bosses. Also, you will eventually be doing maps where you maybe can't freeze or things like that. But that being said, there are no other downsides to freeze. If you can freeze a monster, it cannot move, it cannot attack, it cannot use a spell. It is 100% effective. EHP is a really popular way for build critics these days to tell you that your build is not very tanky. EHP stands for effective hit pool, and it is a somewhat scientific, somewhat arbitrary calculation that Path of Building does in order to give you an idea of how long you'll be able to stay alive if you're taking hits from enemies. The problem with EHP is that it chooses somewhat random hit amounts and then does a calculation based on overtime hits and recovery and your spell suppression, but not if your spell suppression is getting lowered, and your armor based on your current armor total, but not if your flasks are down. It really, in my opinion, is one of the most misleading things that you can gather from a POB. If you have an EHP that is, 1,000, okay, sure, you can say that that build is squishy. But I've played builds that have 100,000 EHP that were significantly squishier than a build that had 25,000 EHP. What I'm trying to get at is defensive layers are all very strong, but in the current landscape of PoE, if you want to play something that isn't necessarily the most meta build, you're probably going to have to find different ways to get some defenses, because you can't donate half of your skill points and half of your gear to getting all of those defensive layers. There are a lot of really popular defensive builds out there that use 90% fizz taken as elements, and then they lower the amount of damage they take from those elements, but it uses most of your gear and half your tree. And the reality is, as someone who creates builds that are off meta, tries to come up with interesting new mechanics and use skills that aren't super popular, you have to be a little bit more creative. And one of the best ways for me to do that is to use freeze, not only as offense, but as defense. I've played 3 freeze builds this league already, and I am having a blast with them. Number 1, shatters. There are a few things in this game that feel better than a series of Herald of Ice shatters across your screen, especially if you have the automaton Herald of Ice effect. You guys can argue in the comments below about what the best Herald of Ice MTX is.
All right, everyone, chill.
So how do we get freeze? How do we freeze monsters reliably? So number 1, you have to hit the monster. This is trivial. For the most part, anytime you're doing cold damage, you're going to have a hit component. Even builds that are cold dot, like the very popular cold dot trickster, that still has a hit component. The vortex hits, the creeping frost hits, and those things can freeze. In order to be able to freeze, unless you're going to use a couple of goofy items that aren't worth it, you need to be able to do some cold damage. The duration of the freeze is based off of the amount of cold damage that you're doing. If you are an all cold build, it's a lot easier to freeze. There are two ways to freeze a monster with cold damage. You can either have chance to freeze, which you can get all over the tree, 15% here and here. There's a bunch of other nodes as well in this area that allow you to get chance to freeze. There are also things like Freezing Pulse has built-in chance to freeze. Frostbite gives you chance to freeze on monsters that are cursed by you. But really the most reliable way is a critical strike. A cold critical strike will inherently freeze a monster if they are capable of being frozen. So I play a lot of critical strike based builds because I find it to be a really fun mechanic to build around. I usually get my crit chance up into the 80s, 90s, or even 100% depending on the character. And if I'm playing a cult build, you're pretty much freezing every time if that monster is capable of being frozen and you have enough damage. In order for that freeze to actually stop the monster from moving, you need to reach the ailment duration minimum for that monster. The calculation is complex, but if you're not freezing and you're doing cold and you're critting, there are ways to make it easier to freeze that monster. So rather than try to give you the formula and try to come up with an exact number, I'll show you how to make your build freeze better if it's not freezing. The number one most important thing is the duration of freeze. What duration of freeze does is, well, it lengthens the duration of your freeze, but more importantly, it lowers the required amount of ailment threshold for you to hit in order to do damage. So let's say a monster has 100 damage and you need to do 5 damage to that monster to freeze it. Well, if you get increased duration of ailments, that means that threshold is going to go lower than 5. You have 100% increased duration of ailments. That means you now only need to go 2.5 damage out of that monster's 100 life in order to land some kind of freeze. Now, obviously, longer freezes are better, but you don't need to freeze monsters for long in order for it to be very effective as a defensive mechanic. If you're hitting several times per second, well, then you only need to freeze them for a portion of a second to get them to stop their animation and have to restart again. Common misconception with freeze is that effect of non-damaging ailments or effect of cold ailments is going to increase your freeze. It actually does not. Effect of non-damaging ailments for cold only affects brittle and chill. And the way that effect works with freeze is if a monster has reduced effect of cold ailments on them, then this will counteract that. That's not super important generally for getting freeze on enemies. I wanted to make this video basically to show people not what the most tanky build in the game is, but what the best single defensive layer is. If you have freeze and then you also have spell suppression and evasion and armor, you're going to feel a hell of a lot tankier than you would have if you just had those 3 defensive layers. If you have questions about freeze, drop them in the comments below or stop on my Twitch, twitch.tv/AER0___, and I will try to answer them as quickly as I can. If you want to support me, give this video a like, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. If you want to support me financially, you can click on the link in the description for my Patreon. For as little as $3 a month, you can help me chase my dream of becoming a full-time content creator. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for all your support. And as always, take care.